So today's super high yield video is one that I'm really proud of. This took a lot of time to create, and I really was careful to include only what you need to know and like literally nothing more. So today's video is on glycogen storage diseases. So what do you need to know, guys? First, we're going to touch on the difference between glycogenolysis versus glycogenesis. That is to say, glycogen synthesis versus glycogen breakdown. And then once we have an understanding of the biochemistry behind all of this stuff, we'll talk about the specific diseases that they love to test you on USMLE and COMLEX. So let's get started with an overview of the biochemistry and talk about glycogenolysis versus glycogenesis. So this is what you usually see in glycolysis, right? You start with glucose, you have step one of glycolysis that creates glucose 6-phosphate, and then if you continued all the way down that pathway, you'd eventually form ATP. And we've already had a video that has discussed glycolysis versus gluconeogenesis, and I would refer you to that video if you need a refresher in this topic. But I'm just bringing this up because where glycogen synthesis and glycogen breakdown occurs is if you pivot off of this pathway. So let's say that you create glucose 6-phosphate, and you really don't need to be doing glycolysis anymore. Instead, you want to store all of that excess glucose as glycogen. So you want to do glycogen synthesis. So what happens? Well, you pivot. So instead of taking that glucose 6-phosphate and carrying out the rest of that glycolysis pathway, you turn, and now we're going to enter into the glycogen synthesis pathway. And the first step is shown here. Phosphoglucomutase is the enzyme, and it turns glucose 6-phosphate into glucose 1-phosphate. Now, for the purposes of USMLE and COMLEX, you don't need to know that enzyme. I've just included it there for completeness sake. Now, once you have glucose 1-phosphate, I'm going to kind of split the pathway into two now. And on the right side, we're going to be talking about glycogen synthesis, and on the left side, we're going to be talking about glycogen breakdown. And this will all make more sense once I draw out the pathway here. Now, the next step is converting that glucose 1-phosphate into something called UDP glucose. So imagine you have this glucose molecule, and then a UDP literally gets stuck right on top of it. And that is catalyzed by the enzyme UDP glucose pyrophosphorylase, and then taking UDP glucose and turning it into glycogen is catalyzed by the enzyme glycogen synthase. So that is glycogen synthesis. Those three enzymes, nothing else. That's glycogen synthesis. You're starting from glucose 6-phosphate in the glycolysis pathway, kind of stealing it from the glycolysis pathway, going to glucose 1-phosphate, and then turning glucose 1-phosphate into glycogen. Those are all the enzymes, and that's just what you need to know about glycogen synthesis. Now, let's say you have glycogen now, it's floating around, and you want to mobilize your glycogen stores, right? Maybe the glucose is low in the body, the blood glucose is low. All of a sudden, glucagon is floating through, yelling at the cells, hey man, release some glucose, our glucose is low. What do? Well, you got to break down that glycogen, go back to glucose 1-phosphate, go back to glucose 6-phosphate, take a left, and get back to glucose. So this is glycogenolysis, also known as lysing glycogen, right? Breaking glycogen down. And when you break glycogen down, you're eventually going to release glucose. So how does that happen? Really simple, guys. One enzyme. Glycogen to glucose 1-phosphate is catalyzed by the enzyme glycogen phosphorylase. Now, that is pretty much all you need to know as far as the biochemistry here. There's a little bit more that we'll get into as we move through this video, but this is the overview. Now, we should talk about a few things. First, the rate-limiting enzyme in each of these steps, in each of these pathways, is extremely high yield, and I've bolded them here for you. Glycogen synthase is the rate-limiting enzyme in glycogen synthesis. Glycogen phosphorylase is the rate-limiting enzyme of glycogenolysis or glycogen breakdown. This is really important because when glycogen synthase is active, glycogen phosphorylase is inactive, and vice versa. So one thing that you should know, in addition to the fact that these are the rate-limiting enzymes, is what regulates each of these enzymes. So glycogen synthase and glycogen synthesis as an entire pathway is turned on and activated by insulin. Conversely, glycogen phosphorylase is turned on and activated by glucagon. Now, if glycogen phosphorylase is activated by glucagon, that means glucagon is going to inhibit glycogen synthase. So whatever activates phosphorylase will inhibit synthase. Whatever activates synthase will inhibit phosphorylase. So these are opposing enzymes, and they are the rate-limiting enzymes, which is a very high-yield concept that you should memorize. Now, what I would like to do is kind of pause for a second and just talk about the glycogen synthesis side of the pathway shown here. Now, when UDP glucose is turned into glycogen, how this works is that every time that glycogen synthase works, it's adding new glycogen bonds in an alpha 1,4 manner. Now, if this could go on to infinity, and what would happen is that you'd have this straight line of alpha 1,4 linkages putting glycogen after glycogen after glycogen on this chain, and eventually it would grow to infinity. But that would be really bad, because if you have a really, really long chain compound, it's toxic to organs in the body. So what you need to do instead is stop the single linear growth of this compound and instead branch it. So that's what a branching enzyme does. A branching enzyme creates an alpha 1,6 linkage or an alpha 1,6 bond. Now let's pause for a second. Knowing visually where the bond is not important for boards. All that you need to know is that glycogen synthase is the rate limiting enzyme of glycogen synthesis, and it slowly adds alpha 1,4 bonds. Eventually, those alpha 1,4 bonds will become too large, and you need to use an alpha 1,6 linkage and branch the chain using branching enzyme. So the name kind of tells you what it does. Now, if we go forward, eventually, in order to break this chain down and release glucose, we're going to have to break the alpha 1,6 bond. You're going to have to do exactly what you see there. So you want to go from position A to position B. Glycogen phosphorylase will turn glycogen into glucose 1-phosphate. But then you need something called the debranching enzyme to cut that 1,6 bond and release the glucose 1-phosphate into glucose 6-phosphate. So basically, let's slow down. Debranching enzyme comes in after glycogen phosphorylase. So glycogen phosphorylase creates the glucose 1-phosphate. Then debranching enzyme will cut that 1,6 bond and turn glucose 1-phosphate into glucose 6-phosphate. Glucose 6-phosphate will take a left, as you see in the pathway there shown in green, which again is glycogenolysis. And using the enzyme glucose 6-phosphatase, glucose 6-phosphate turns into glucose, and glucose can be released into the blood to serve its purpose. So here is an overview of everything we've talked about so far. At the top, we started with glucose 6-phosphate and actually came down to glucose 1-phosphate. Glucose 1-phosphate was turned into UDP glucose, which was then turned into glycogen. Every time UDP glucose was turned into glycogen, you formed an alpha 1,4 linkage. Eventually, that very linear compound would become too large and would become very toxic to organs in the body. So we used branching enzyme to create an alpha 1,6 branch in the chain. If the body wanted to go through glycogenolysis and release free glucose, we would have to take that branched chain and first go through glycogen phosphorylase to create glucose 1-phosphate. Then, the glucose 1-phosphate would use the debranching enzyme to cut that 1,6 branched chain. Then, we have glucose 6-phosphate using the enzyme glucose 6-phosphatase being turned into free glucose. So this is the overview, and I've now summarized everything. I know that I kind of spoke a lot, and it may seem a bit overwhelming, but it's very important that you understand this biochemistry, because everything that you see on this slide is how we're going to understand where the diseases come into play and what goes wrong in glycogen storage diseases. So let's talk about the first one. If you don't have the enzyme glucose 6-phosphatase, shown there in the top left of this slide, you get something called von Gierke disease. So because we don't have glucose 6-phosphatase, we cannot form free glucose. We're going to have a buildup of glucose 6-phosphate. So von Gierke disease is a lack of glucose 6-phosphatase. And literally, I took the top of that slide that you just saw, and because we don't have glucose 6-phosphatase, we get a buildup of glucose 6-phosphate. And as you might imagine, this is really bad, right? We can't form free glucose, and glucose 6-phosphate is just accumulating in the liver. So the symptoms of this disease should not surprise you. You're going to see hepatomegaly, or big liver, because glucose 6-phosphate is accumulating in the liver. And you're going to see hypoglycemia, or low blood sugar, because you cannot form that free glucose to raise the blood glucose. Now, something that is another symptom that you really need to know are hyperlipidemia and hyperuricemia. Now, the reason that this occurs is because you're unable to get free glucose, you need to get your energy through the fat and protein breakdown. So if you break down fats, you'll have hyperlipidemia. And if you break down proteins, you'll have hyperuricemia. So to summarize, von Gierke's disease or von Gierke disease is a lack of glucose 6-phosphatase, which causes an elevation of glucose 6-phosphate accumulating in the liver, causing big liver, also known as hepatomegaly, causing hypoglycemia because it can't be turned into free glucose, and causing high levels of fat and uric acid in the body because you have to go through the fat and protein catabolism pathways in order to get your energy. So how do we remember all this stuff? Well, instead of von Gierke disease, I want you to think von Geek disease. And here's a fat geek at his computer, again, a character taken from South Park, and he is fat, he has no muscle, and he has fatty liver because he's so overweight and does not take good care of himself. So this is what we see in von Gierke disease, also known now as von Geek disease. Hyperlipidemia, because he's fat, hyperuricemia, because we're breaking down muscle and causing uric acid to be released, and fatty liver because he does not take care of himself. That is von Gierke disease due to a lack of glucose 6-phosphatase. So that's what we talked about so far, right? The purple star was von Gierke disease. Now, what happens if we don't have D-branching enzyme? Well, you get something called CORI disease. So CORI disease is a lack of the D-branching enzyme, and the D-branching enzyme is also known as alpha-1,6-glucosidase. Now, think about this for a second. You're going to get all of the same symptoms as von Gierke disease. The only difference is that you're going to have an abnormal glycogen structure. Because remember, normally glycogen is branched, and D-branching enzyme cuts the 1,6 bond and releases it so that it can be used as glucose. If you cannot cut that bond, you're going to have an abnormal glycogen structure, but you're going to have the same symptoms of von Gierke disease because you still can't produce free glucose, so you'll be hypoglycemic, and you still have an abnormal accumulation of something in the liver causing hepatomegaly. So CORI disease and von Gierke disease are very, very similar. The only difference is that in CORI disease, you have an abnormal accumulation of this super branched glycogen structure that cannot be cut and debranched because we lack the debranching alpha-1,6-glucosidase enzyme. So it's very similar to von Gierke, with an abnormal glycogen structure. Now, how do we remember this? When I think of CORI disease, I think of coral disease. And coral, like a coral reef, I think of this. This is a coral reef, and it is very, very branched. What else is very, very branched, guys? Well, an abnormal glycogen that cannot be debranched. So CORI disease, I think of coral reef. That is a super branched plant that lives in the sea, and that is literally what glycogen looks like if it cannot be cut up, and it just keeps branching, keeps accumulating in the liver in its abnormally branched structure. You get hypoglycemia, hepatomegaly, and abnormal glycogen accumulation in the liver. How beautiful is that mnemonic? So that is CORI disease. Now, what happens if you don't have glycogen phosphorylase? Well, if you don't have glycogen phosphorylase, there are two diseases that can occur. The first one is called McArdle's disease, and the second one is called HERS disease. These diseases are extremely similar, and the way that we're going to understand the symptoms of each of these diseases is by understanding where the glycogen phosphorylase is absent. So glycogen phosphorylase is an enzyme that can be in both the muscle and in the liver. McArdle's disease, and I put the apostrophe there, of course, after the wrong letter because I'm an idiot, but if you don't have glycogen phosphorylase in the muscle, you get McArdle's disease. If you don't have glycogen phosphorylase in the liver, aka the hepatic, you get HERS disease. And it should be no surprise that my mnemonic there is M to M and H to H. Hepatic for HERS, muscle for McArdle's. This is a lack of glycogen phosphorylase. Now, the symptoms in these diseases are kind of similar, but there's a little bit of difference depending on your understanding of what a muscle does versus what a liver does. So let's just touch on this briefly. In McArdle's disease, you're going to get muscle cramps and hypoglycemia on exertion, as well as myoglobinuria. Think about it, guys. Lack of glycogen phosphorylase in the muscle means that glycogen is stuck in the muscle. It cannot get out as glucose 1-phosphate to be turned into glucose 6-phosphate to be turned into free glucose. You're going to have glycogen sitting in the muscle cell, hanging out like a fat slob. And when anything accumulates in a muscle cell, what do you think happens? Well, during exercise, when the muscle needs to be able to break down that glycogen and kick it out and turn it into glucose so that it can use the energy, it's not going to happen. So you're going to get hypoglycemic when you exert yourself, and you're also going to get muscle cramps when you exert yourself because the muscle not only can't turn it into glucose to use for energy, but it's just a giant ball of shit in the muscle cell. What do you think happens if a bunch of stuff stays in a muscle cell? Of course, it's going to break down the muscle cell, and that's why you get myoglobinuria. So think of it as like dead muscle cells being pissed out in the urine. That's McArdle's disease. So muscle cramps, hypoglycemia, both on exertion, myoglobinuria, because the muscle cell breaks down because all of that glycogen just sits in it. Now, HER's disease, I told you, is glycogen phosphorylase deficiency, but in the liver or in the hepatic. When that happens, you're going to get hepatomegaly because you're having glycogen sit in the liver, unable to get out. Liver's going to get big. You're going to get fasting hypoglycemia, and this is a really subtly high yield point here that differentiates HER's disease from McArdle's disease. The liver is responsible for a baseline level of basically releasing free glucose to maintain sugar. So in McArdle's disease, where you only become hypoglycemic when you exert yourself because the muscles can't use their energy, in HER's disease, you'll have fasting hypoglycemia because the liver can't really do its baseline job of maintaining blood glucose. So HER's disease in the hepatic, McArdle's disease in the muscle. That's a lack of glycogen phosphorylase and the inability to do glycogenolysis. So we are making great progress. Now let's talk about something called Anderson disease. So Anderson disease is if the branching enzyme doesn't work. So the branching enzyme is basically, just as a reminder, what takes those alpha-1,4 linkages that the glycogen synthase is making and branches the glycogen to make it non-toxic to the organs in the body. So if we lack the branching enzyme that creates the alpha-1,6 branched linkage, you get Anderson disease. Now, I told you, if you have a super long straight compound, which would be the case if the branching enzyme didn't exist and all you did was keep making those alpha-1,4 bonds and forming that long straight compound of glycogen, you would get cirrhosis because it's just completely fatal to your liver. So this would turn into this. You have this completely long, completely toxic, long, single line compound that cannot fit in the liver. It damages the liver. It causes repeated fibrosis and inflammation in the liver, which is cirrhosis, and it's absolutely fatal. So if you don't have the branching enzyme and can't create those alpha-1,6 bonds, you're going to get Anderson disease. You're going to get cirrhosis. That single long chain glycogen is going to accumulate in the liver. So how do we remember this? Anderson disease, I think of Anderson Cooper, and he gets straight to the point. So straight reminds me that this is one long straight line glycogen that is not branched. Anderson disease, Anderson Cooper, he gets straight line to the point. That's Anderson disease. Don't overwhelm yourself, just memorize it. Anderson disease, straight to the point. One straight compound because it can't be branched. Now, this is everything we've talked about so far. We did von GIERKE, CORI, McArdle's, HER's, and Anderson. There's one more disease that you need to know, and I saved the pathophysiology for the end because it's really simple and it didn't really fit in with the rest of this schematic. It didn't really fit with the rest of the biochemistry. So CORI disease, I told you, is when debranching enzyme isn't working or isn't there. Now, debranching enzyme also exists in lysosomes. So here's a lysosome shown there with debranching enzyme inside of it. So a lysosome literally walks around and kind of scavenges not only glycogen, but things that look like glycogen, and it has a debranching enzyme in there to cut it up and make use of it the same way that you see there with CORI disease. Now, if a lysosome lacks debranching enzyme, you get something called Pompe disease. And Pompe disease is a lack of the debranching enzyme, but specifically in lysosomes. And the really high yield symptom here that this causes is cardiomegaly. So the heart is a muscle. And if you lack the ability to debranch glycogen in a muscle, specifically through the lysosome, then the branched glycogen will accumulate in muscle, in lysosomes, in the heart. So I know that sounds crazy. It's a lot of like sort of extra stuff to remember, but let's slow down. Pompe disease is the same thing as CORI disease, but if a lysosome lacks the debranching enzyme. So it's lysosome specific. So how do we remember this? Pompe disease, think of the actual location, Pompeii, and think of Mount Vesuvius. Mount Vesuvius filled up for so long with lava, eventually exploding. And that's literally what happens in Pompe disease. So in Pompe disease, you will have an accumulation of branched glycogen in the lysosomes because you lack lysosomal debranching enzyme, which will accumulate in the heart, causing hypertrophic cardiomegaly. Eventually, you'll probably experience heart failure if you have Pompe disease and die early. So people with Pompe disease, this is a fatal condition because they incur hypertrophic cardiomegaly and cardiomyopathy because of that accumulation. So that's exactly what happened in Mount Vesuvius, right? Lava accumulated, becoming hypertrophic, eventually exploding. The other way to remember this is that Pompeii affects the pump. So Pompeii disease affects the pump. The heart is the pump. That's Pompeii disease. So, don't bog yourself down too much, but just remember Pompeii affects the pump. It's a lack of D-branching enzyme, but specific to the lysosome. So that's Pompeii disease. Guys, that's it. This is the summary slide. I know I absolutely flew through this lecture and I flew through the biochemistry, but come back to this slide and look at what we have here. Enzymes are shown in red. Rate-limiting enzymes are bolded. Diseases are shown in purple. Glycogen synthesis is shown with the blue arrows. Glycogenolysis, or aka glycogen breakdown, is shown in the green arrows. And where we're branched versus debranched is shown with those orange boxes. That is everything you need to know about glycogen storage diseases.